that's okay. We got plenty to talk about. We'll probably run out of time before we run out of subjects. It's really a treat to talk to David Perell. It's a kind of a change up from the podcast you've heard lately with Neil deGrasse Tyson and with Michio Kaku and other luminaries of the astronomical variety. But today having David Perell, who is an up-and-coming star, building on our intrinsic capabilities and hopefully upgrading them, giving us a life 2.0, as past guest Max Tegmark classifies life. Life 3.0, David, is artificial intelligence. And as Einstein said, I don't know what weapons will be used to fight World War III, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So I don't know what Life 4.0 will be like, but you guys building a second brain, you and your partner, Tiago Forte, I wanted to have you on, and I'm a big fan of your work and his work, and I just wanted to showcase what you guys are doing for my audience. So welcome to the Into the Impossible podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. It's kind of crazy how many guests you've had of people I just really admire and look up to.
Yeah, of course. I became aware of your work. I don't really remember exactly how I found you, but those are serendipitous things that add delight and intrigue to life. But my main motivation is sort of a personal one, which is to enhance not only my brain, but in so doing, enhance my Brian. And so I'm interested in building a second Brian. But before we get there, I think of what you do as providing the most critical skill that is also the least taught. And I'm saying that as a scientist, as someone who works with engineers. We have almost no training in how to write for our audience, but certainly for a non-technical audience. And lately, my big crusade, if you will, is that scientists have a moral obligation to explain what we do to the general public, because you guys out there pay my salary via your taxes, assuming you pay your taxes. I know you do, David. I know you moved to Texas, but nevertheless, you pay your taxes. So tell me, why is it the most important skill, and yet we teach it to almost nobody in this field or almost any other field?
I agree. When I read scientific writing, the lack of writing education shows. It shows. It's not hard to see that writing isn't taught very well. I mean, just think about it, right? Like, to the extent that scientists believe that they're doing important work, I believe that there's an actual moral obligation to learn how to write and to communicate things in ways that are easy to understand and clear. And there's always some kind of trade-off between technical precision and the ability for people to understand what is being said. But, one of the things that I think a lot about is, it's a lot of people get upset with this, and I understand why, but I think that these people provide a great service to the world. And those are the people who, like Bill Bryson, right? He goes out and takes a lot of biological research or anthropological research and just writes this book on the body, and it's just magnificently written. It has stories. The writing is personal, it's observational, it's playful, it pops, and it then addresses the total addressable market for these important ideas. And I really wish that more scientists were able to write well and communicate their ideas. And I think that those who do, such as David Deutsch comes to mind, are able to have a tremendous influence. It's amazing. You mentioned Einstein earlier. His writing is quite clear. And something weird happened with 20th century literature, with 20th century philosophy, and with a lot of 20th century scientific writing. I mean, I read Descartes' Meditations last week, and it wasn't easy to read, but it's definitely easier to read than modern scientific thinking, and that was written 400 years ago.
Yeah, I point out that Galileo Galilei, who was the first really popular science writer of any renown, he wrote in classic style, but also with modern twist to it. And so much so was he a wonderful kind of lyricist with his writing that he was able, through his writing, to discover new modalities of the human condition. I'll bring one to your attention right now, which I find so beautiful, and it's an example of something that you've spoken about at different times, but it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically the steepness of the learning curve lulls one into a false sense of of undeserved arrogance. And what Galileo said 400 years ago in his dialogue on two universal systems, he said, this vain presumption of understanding everything can have no other basis than never understanding anything. For anyone who had experienced just once the perfect understanding of one single thing and had truly tasted how knowledge is accomplished would recognize that of the infinity of other truths, he understands nothing. And I think it's so beautiful to look at this man who was an incredible scientist. He had incredible foibles as well. He had, as we all do, certain habits, certain misdeeds and tendencies that led to his undoing. And maybe some of that could have been avoided if he weren't such a good writer. Obviously, the dialogue got him into the ultimate home imprisonment in which he ended his final days. But if knowledge, this paradox of knowledge, again, a topic you've addressed in your wonderful YouTube channel, in Perell.com, in your writings, is something that you do every day. You write every day, and that's a habit of the greatest scientists in history, too. Maybe not writing, but doing some kind of experiment. And so I'd love to talk about, your kind of approach to creativity and whether or not we can teach creativity and or imagination, as that's a big focus of my group and the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Can that be taught? Can you teach someone to be a good writer, or can you merely imitate previous writers? And what is the best way to teach someone to develop their own voice?
Yeah, so creativity is something that can only be cultivated, but you can't just like snap your finger, just come up with something creative. But you can cultivate a life that does make you more creative. And I use that terminology very deliberately. A life that makes you more creative. Creativity isn't something that you just do and you sit down and it just emerges. Like, creativity is a way of being. And the reason why I write every day is because of this sort of paradox that I sense inside of the creative process, which is, on one hand, it is true that history's great creatives have been very spiky in terms of their ability to have a piece of great output. One of the things that I find to be very surprising is how many of the great novels, how many of the great essays, even my own essays that I'm pretty proud of, were written in an extremely short amount of time. Mm-hmm. And so people learn that, they see that, and they say, oh, great. That means I only have to do creative work when I'm inspired. That means I don't need to show up most of the days. And I say, you know what? That's actually not true, because what you realize is that if you show up every single day, most days are actually just going to be quite frustrating. But those days where you don't get much done are like the price of admission for those breakthrough moments. And I actually kind of think of it like going to the gym. Like, the most important days of going to the gym aren't the days where you're inspired to go lift heavy weights and break a sweat. The most important days are the days where you don't feel like going and you go anyway, and you leave and you're like, that wasn't a great workout today. And it's actually the same thing with creativity, because you never know when it's going to come. And if you give yourself the space and the time to sit down and focus, you never know what's going to emerge. And there's this weird thing where most days feel like a total failure. You feel like you didn't get anything done, and somehow, some way, you look back at what you've achieved over months or years, and you're like, wow, how did I do all that? And so once you start showing up every day, you have time on your side where then you're just putting little bets into the world, and you look back and you're like, wow, I actually did something.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the kind of length versus time. I think Voltaire said, if I had more time, I would have made it shorter, which is kind of the paradox of creativity. And I know that you are also in training to become a private pilot. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been a pilot for almost 30 years now.
Really?
Yes, yeah. I've flown, started off flying little tiny Cessnas and worked my way up and have aspirations for even bigger hardware. As you know, it's an addiction. So once you tasted flight
so did
once...
you go through, you get your instrument, and then
Oh, yes.
you kept going?
Yes, I have a
Nice.
commercial. I have a multi-engine. I even have a what's called a type rating, which is to fly a specific jet, which I hope someday to be able to do. And that's a separate rating. And I've started to work on becoming a flight instructor, and that is in part to work someday to teach my children. I've got several children; they're all interested in aviation. But I also recognize the adage that I was taught the day I got my private pilot's license, which was that once you stop learning, you stop living. In other words, you're gonna start dying in a sense. And because we have to learn from the mistakes of others as a pilot, the saying is, you won't live long enough to make all the mistakes yourself, literally. Um, I wanted to become a teacher of flight instruction. Now, I'm a professor at a top 10 research university, and I was never taught how to teach. No one ever sat me down, taught me how to teach. I wrote a best-selling book. No one ever taught me how to write scientifically or write for the lay audience. And I think it's so scary. It's actually frightening because the FAA, as you're learning, is a government entity. They have rules. They have things. Your flight instructor had to learn what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that is the needs that somebody is requiring in order to flourish in life, but also to teach somebody something. They need to feel physically safe, mentally, emotionally. They need to have their biological needs met. Can you teach that? I always think it's funny because it's the only branch of the U.S. government. Like, you can't go into the IRS handbook for tax adjusters and find like your people need love. Like it's not in there. Like the person you're auditing needs to feel loved. Again with the taxes, but in terms of teaching the teachers, I guess a crisper way to say it is like, how did you learn to teach, and is that making you a better writer?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I learned to teach by loathing school. Like I thought school, like I actually think it's criminal in terms of just how hard it is on people like me who have some kind of weird mental stuff going on in terms of like maybe some dyslexia, just like wires getting crossed and stuff, but in a way that is actually quite helpful for me in terms of being creative. I also have so much energy and I just have a need to do things. I have a need to be social. Can then, I'm sort of over there and get really distracted easily, but then also have an ability to focus really intensely. And the thing that I always needed in life was basically just like get away from me and just give me the resources and the tools to help me when I get stuck. But please just let me do things and let me go at my own speed. And it was really hard because I remember in college, man, I took a media arts and entertainment class my senior year of college. And during this class, I got recruited for my first job by the CEO of a major advertising agency in New York that when I went to go work there, we did about $45 million dollars a year in revenue, right? So like we're a decent size. And he recruited me basically saying, oh my goodness, you're 21 years old. I can't believe how well you understand this industry. And that happened at the same time that I got a C in my media arts and entertainment class. And it was just because all of school moved both way too fast for me and way too slow for me. So if there were things that I was interested in, such as the way that Netflix and HBO were contending with traditional cable networks and how that was intersecting with YouTube, I was like, oh my goodness, Brian, this is so interesting. But then there were other parts of this class that I just had no interest in whatsoever. And the inability and the actually lack of encouragement as a student to say, hey, you're interested in this thing, go explore it, go crazy. And the gift that I had was my dad. My dad, growing up, any single thing that I was passionate about, he was like, dude, just go for it. I mean, we lived in a family that we didn't do gifts, we didn't do birthday presents, we never really went out to dinner, we didn't really do many extravagant trips. I mean, when we did trips, they were really focused around learning. But the one thing that I was just totally spoiled with was if I wanted to learn something, I had an unlimited budget of money, which wasn't that expensive, but the thing that was the gift was my dad's time and energy and encouragement. And growing up for 18 years under that, whether it was aviation, whether it was baseball, whether it was golf, whether it was one time in 2006, I was in sixth grade, we had this project called the iSearch. And basically, you're just supposed to pick a question and go answer it, whatever. And so I'm like, no, this is not whatever. I'm going to get really into something. So what I did was I asked a very simple question. How will the Boeing 787 fly? And the Boeing 787 wasn't supposed to come out till 2008, 2009. And this was 2006 when I wrote this. And my dad had known someone from the Schweitzer family, and the Schweitzer family, they're behind one of the big glider companies. Yeah. And I think that they were bought by Boeing or affiliated by Boeing. So, I mean, we fly up to Seattle. We go to the Boeing factory. I touch and feel the first ever Boeing 787 airplane. I come longer than the average student. I end up getting more than a perfect score on this project. And this was from somebody who got terrible grades, I graduated from high school with a 2.8 GPA. I got roughly average marks on the ACT and the SAT, the two standardized tests. I mean, I say with no hyperbole that I thought that I was going to be kind of a failure in life for the first 24 years of my life. But this one project, I got the second best grade in the class. I will never forget my friend Alex, who did better than me. And I think that this just gets back to my main point about learning and about teaching. Like, what if for a certain kind of human, and maybe it's 5% of the world, maybe it's 10%, I don't know, somebody smarter than me can do the science. What if the idea of like curriculums and going at a similar cadence in the whole class, maybe that's just totally wrong. Maybe certain people actually need to just be more unconstrained in what they're able to do. And the problem is that's a high variance strategy. If you do that, you're going to have some people who don't do anything, who just sit back and say, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm just not even going to try. And you're going to have other people who just go crazy. And the thing with most education policy that we're trying to do is lower the variance. We're trying to have more equal outcomes. And look, we can debate the merits of equality versus exceptionalism, as Eric Weinstein says, excellence versus genius. But fine, I'm happy to have that debate. But I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the trade-offs that we're making when we try to narrow the distribution of outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up your, high school, struggles that you had yesterday. As I mentioned, I talked to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he said he did well on the SATs back in the day, but he didn't do, phenomenally well on the verbal component of it. And then about 10 years ago, he got a letter in the mail from the Educational Testing Services, and he was like, "Oh no." They found, they think I cheated, or I don't know. They're coming to revoke my score, which was, was good, but it wasn't great. And he opened it up, and it said, "Dear Dr. Tyson, we're writing to ask you if we have your permission to use some of the prose from one of your books as an example for the upcoming SATs, in the future." So basically, it would be like a writing sample, and then people would analyze it, for example. And he was like, I would react, wow, you guys want to use losing the Nobel Prize? And he was like, F you. Like, you made my life a living hell, these standardized tests, and I didn't fit into all the boxes, and I had to work my ass off, and eventually he gave them permission. But just hearing you talk about those struggles, but kind of the only clarity that you achieve in life is sometimes by looking at it in reverse. And I'll get to questions I ask, what would you advise, your 20-year-old self? I mean, you're still so young. It's amazing how much you've accomplished in such a short time. But I want to turn to your process because...
Wait, can I say one thing on that real quick?
Of course.
So 2 things. The first is standardized tests are so tricky because... So I have a friend named Rob Henderson. And he grew up without. He was an orphan, and his parents were nowhere to be found growing up. And the reason that he ended up getting into Yale was because his standardized tests he had such high marks. And so I think that the sort of the subtlety of the standardized tests right now is something that we need to be a little bit more intelligent about as we talk about them societally, because the thing is, standardized tests for people like myself and maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson just don't measure some sort of ineffable quality. That is absolutely true. But the problem is a lot of people say that and they're like, oh, it doesn't measure intelligence. Like, let's just ban standardized tests. And in another way, standardized testing is, as far as my read on the data, one of the most equitable tools that we have that allow people who don't come from traditional backgrounds to prove their merits and their intelligence. And I was reading about this last week, and it seems like standardized test tutoring and stuff actually isn't as effective as we think in terms of people's ability to get better. And so I do just want to say, although standardized tests didn't measure something for me, I do think that there are really good things about them. And I haven't, like, I would like to see sort of more nuanced takes on things. The other thing with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he said something to me that was absolutely life changing. So I got to interview him in 2016. I just graduated from college. And I went into his office at the Museum of Natural History. And, it's really cool because usually in life-changing things, you don't know that they're going to change your life in the moment. Interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson when you're 22 years old, it's going to be a life-changing day. And so you can prepare for the day. And so I go into his office and, I interview him similar to how we're doing it, but in person. And he said something to me, and he said, I said, how do you communicate so eloquently? You're just a masterful speaker. And he goes, everything that I say in public is something that I've written down before. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way that that's true. I get that you speak eloquently, but there's no way. You talk all the time. How could it possibly be that it's something that you've written down before? And in retrospect, now that I've written every single day, he told me to write every single day. Now that I've done it for 5 years now, I know that that's true.
Yeah.
And if you look at Neil deGrasse Tyson's ability to speak well, a lot of that is a result of the diligence that he has to write consistently.
Yeah, and even more than that, I made the mistake of, asking a question which I knew the answer to, but I wanted him to elucidate it in his inimitable way. And I said, in early in your life, you were encouraged more to pursue athleticism, but you were able to succeed in academia, despite kind of the stereotyping of that he should go into athletics. And, it was just that self-confidence that you had, is that a byproduct of natural gifts that you had? And he said, wait a second, basically, he said, I'm going to play the race card. And I was like, holy crap, what do you mean you're going to play the race card on me? And he said, that question assumes that if I'm born with something, that I didn't also do a tremendous amount of work. And he went through this vignette, and you'll hear it on my podcast when it comes out next week, but he went through his meticulous preparation process. When he goes on The Daily Show or Stephen Colbert or whatever, he wouldn't just, I'm going to go and have a conversation. He would study past episodes. He would break down the statistics of how long between questions does Stephen Colbert wait? How long in time does he go back to reference past events so that Neil could have a strict amount of attention to only the most relevant data? And therefore, it was a compression algorithm, and something I know you're very fond of discussing. But it was interesting because I actually knew that he had done that, because I had to use the Tyson technique, which I hope that my listeners will take advantage of, and your listeners, I'll send the video to your team as well. But the point being that nobody's born being a good public speaker, as we already established, but the best ones work the hardest. And it's what I call this Tyson technique of treating everything, even as seemingly inconsequential as I'm talking. Okay, it's not inconsequential to talk to millions of people on national TV, but talking to a comedian as an astrophysicist of his genius, it was very interesting to me to hear that he put such meticulous preparation. So it's not a surprise to me. And I remember you telling that story on one of your podcasts about your encounter with him.
Yeah. So yesterday I went to lunch with an actress, and she was on House and in Once Upon a Time, and she was talking to me about what it was like, how she prepares. And so she's been helping her boyfriend, who's also an actor, on a new show that he's working on. And so they were filming in Vancouver, and they had 14 days of quarantine. And she was like, every single day for those 14 days, we went through the script. We talked about exactly how we were going to think about our our facial expressions, our body movements, what the script meant. And this was the key moment. It's what I call practice analytically, perform intuitively, where what you do, and this is exactly what Neil deGrasse Tyson was doing, this is exactly what this actor was doing. You begin to know the material and prepare so intensely that you, rather than knowing the ideas with your rational conscious mind, you know them with your intuitive body awareness. And rather than thinking about something and then doing that thing, the ideas work through you. And so I think what it means to really be prepared as a speaker is you kind of go over this mountain of complexity. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, for an idea on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. For an idea on the other side of complexity, I'd give you everything in the world. And so I think that what happens is we start off when we're just BSing something, we're intuitive in this weird way, and then we kind of get into this rational place where we're trying to perform, but our minds are steering the ship. But then once again, we end up intuitively with excellence, which actually comes from the ideas working through you in a way that you're super prepared. And I suspect that that's what Neil deGrasse Tyson would say he's doing.
Yeah. So talk about your kind of attention to detail, which I do think comes from attention itself. You've written extensively about your favorite scientific paper, which is called Driven by Compression Progress.
So good. Oh my goodness.
By Jürgen, you're going to have to help me. Jürgen Schmiddenhuber, I think.
At Cornell.
Yes, although I guess he was at Garching when he wrote this paper. What do you make of attention, the attention economy? I'll say one thing and then I want to get your reaction. So Sam Harris has said that the most valuable commodity is not time, because time is fungible in a sense. You can always, not watch that cat video that is playing in the background, right? We have time to do things that are all sorts of wastefulness. Attention is another thing. When I'm playing with my kids and scrolling, Instagram, or doing something else, thinking, I'm in synagogue and I'm supposed to be thinking about God and these existential questions, and I'm like, I wonder how many emails, are piling up. I want to ask you, do you agree with that statement that attention is? Because I actually believe there's another commodity even more precious and irretrievable than attention. Say that again?
I'm going to guess trust. What is it?
So for me, it's innocence. I believe innocence is a ratchet and pawl, that it only goes in one direction. Once you have seen something, you can't unsee it. Once you've done something, you can't undo it. And sometimes you can use that to your advantage. As you said, like, you're going to do the work every day. It's like you're going to go to the gym. You're going to write 1,000 words a day. You're going to do whatever it is. And so, but it also can be negative. Once you commit adultery, I'm told, it's very easy to do it the second time. Once you commit a robbery, the first time is the hardest. And so I've interviewed people, David, on my show that were, war veterans, and they killed people. It was their life or this enemy combatant's life, and they killed him, and they killed dozens of people. And he agreed with me. He was like, I can't undo it. I'm glad I did it. My kids would be orphaned, or wouldn't have a father had I not done it, but I cannot undo it. And for me, that meant for my kids, I want to keep them as innocent as possible for as long as possible. And therefore, I think innocence is the most precious commodity. And maybe that does have trust built into it, because they have to trust you as a parent as well. And, I'm not expecting you to react necessarily to all of this, but in your estimation, attention seems to play a big deal in your life. So how do you choose what to spend your attention on? I agree, it is a valuable commodity.
Yeah, so there's two cuts on this. There's attention in terms of where I place my own attention, and then there's attention in terms of the attention economy. So just very simply, your life is sort of the sum of what you focus on. And it sounds trite, but I think it's true. And it's like a chef. If you talk to a really good chef, they would say, there's no way I'm going to cook a world-class meal without world-class ingredients. And so a lot of my thinking, and in terms of how I collect ideas and consume the world, is high quality inputs, the really good Wagyu steak or freshly picked strawberries of information. And then there's the flip side of attention, which is the economy of attention. That is how you think about monetization on the internet. And attention is fine, but I don't think that attention really converts into meaningful outcomes without trust. And the thing is, you can buy attention. You can go on Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, all of which have billion-dollar marketing departments, and you can get people to look at whatever it is that you're selling, whoever it is that you are. You can buy that. The thing that you can't buy is trust. You can't buy relationships. And it's actually in the synthesis of trust and attention that I think magical outcomes via the internet happen.
Mm-hmm. And when I think about that attention and sort of how computers can act as a second brain, I made this point actually to my children, kind of building on what you and Tiago work on, this notion that you have a very good wet supercomputer that's good for ideation, coming up with ideas and creativity and imagination, which a computer cannot do. I always say people make so much, David, of the fact that computers can beat any human at chess. Computers can beat any human at Go. My whole thing is I don't care about AI. I don't care about artificial intelligence. I care about artificial wisdom. Can a computer create the game of chess? Can a computer come up with general relativity just given the laws of Newtonian relativity? I don't think that they can, but my focus is on the second part, that computers are very good at doing things that humans aren't so good at: memorization, storage, compression, etc. So I think of this article on compression as sort of the hybrid, because if you can compress information, it allows you to store fewer things to reproduce the whole. But of course, the definition of complexity, something is more complex, the more bits of a computer program would be required to fully explain it. Nowadays, we hear a lot about AI, and I want to go into your thoughts about AI and how that could build a third brain, perhaps. I'm working on a project now, the first time in human history, taking the words of Galileo, turning them into an audiobook with the famous physicist Carlo Rovelli and others.
Cool.
Yeah, so no one had ever done it. I took on this project as part of a video I did for Prager University, which is called Galileo's Dialogue. And I was like, I'm going to read this 539-page book in a month. I mean, I could only get through a couple of pages of it when I was a kid. And I said, I'll just listen to the audiobook because, as you point out, you can listen at 2x speed. So that'll be great. And Audible, where is the audio? There's not a single audiobook, David, of any of Galileo's books. There's nothing of Newton, and who was a much worse writer in terms of public consumption. Principia is almost unreadable, even for a physicist. But Galileo, as I showed before, is beautiful. It's majestic. It's evocative. And so I said, this is a shame. I'm going to make the first audiobook of Galileo's in human history. And if that works, we'll continue and do all of his books, because eventually there'll be about 2 or 3 million words that Galileo said that no one's ever heard, read by Italians. And then I said, well, why stop there? Why not dump that into GPT-3 and create artificial Galileo, Galileo, and actually have him as an avatar and start to think about him. And I start to think, maybe this is not the first time this has ever been done. If we just take the second brain to its logical conclusion, eventually we get hyper advanced artificial intelligence, in which case maybe I'm being simulated by this intelligent agent to produce what I think is a work of original thinking. And so I want to ask you, where is the next evolution of, before we get into your speculation on general artificial intelligence and Turing machines and so forth, where are we going in terms of augmentation of the human brain? I want to turn Galileo into a teacher of physics because he's a much better teacher of the inclined plane than I could ever be. So I want to make an artificial Galileo as a teacher, and that maybe could make some kind of impact on education. But where are we going? What's the next brain, if you will, in this hierarchical system?
Well, I have no idea. So let me speculate. I mean, I think that one of the most important choices you have to make in your career is, are you going to be more like computers or less like computers? And I think that that's a question to always be asking. And, there's there's ways that I see good arguments for both. I think a lot of, at times, software developers and want to be more like computers in terms of aligning how they think about the world with the way that a computer actually works, and to actually speak the language of a computer is probably the highest leverage, one of the highest leverage things that you can do in society right now. But even within that, if you want to think more like a computer in terms of speaking their language, I think that you then want to differentiate yourself from computers and have a kind of division of labor where what you do is sort of like what you were saying. A computer can get really good at chess, but they can't invent chess. They can get really good at Go, but they can't invent Go, and get really good at thinking in open-ended ways and unbounded spaces. And it's that I don't actually know enough about the science of AGI to have a sense of how close that actually is. But at the same time, I mean, I just think about this all the time of how do you actually use technology instead of letting it use you? How do you actually cooperate with technology instead of competing against it? And I mean, the way that I think of it is about aligning yourself with the internet, basically, of saying, okay, the internet, basically, what it gives us is, Naval Ravikant says that there's all these little, the robots are already here. They just are working in data centers, and they're not just walking on the streets like Asimov's iRobot. And what that means to me very practically is that, take this podcast. What's happening right now to everybody who's listening, I think of like little minions who are like carrying the ones and zeros across the world, maybe from Indonesia to South Africa to Argentina to Russia. And these ones and zeros are traveling at the speed of light from my mouth into a microphone, then underwater cables, and then into somebody's ear. It's absolutely incredible. And I think it's what it means to be what I call a citizen of the internet, is to be somebody who is able to put the internet to work for you instead of trying to run and compete against it. Because guess what? Computers, they don't sleep. They can work way faster than you'll ever be able to. But there are certain things, such as about creativity and just the humanity that I think we all crave, that humans aren't able to do. And so I'm always thinking about division of labor, asking, what are computers really good at? How can I differentiate myself from computers? And in the partnership of man and machine, I think amazing things happen right now.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll look forward to the building the fourth brain. We'll have to see how that comes along. Maybe Galileo can teach writing and physics later on. I want to move to another topic that I kind of just gleaned from you, and I refer people to both your course, Rite of Passage, your course with Tiago called Building a Second Brain, and also your website, Perell.com, your Friday newsletter, your Monday newsletter. You don't write enough, David. You're kind of slacking off here. I mean, there's 5 other days of the week, man. Come on. But I subscribe. I read everyone thoroughly. I click on all the beautiful links. It's a lovely presentation of art, technology, science, and wonderful writing. One thing you said caught my eye a couple months ago. You said, strive not for fame, and yet strive for niche fame. And you gave an example, which I love. Your writing is replete with examples, which is what the human brain, the wet one at least, needs in order to construct analogies that allows for actionable activity to take place. You said an example of niche fame is being a professor. Someone who is, respected in his field, who can be, relied on to give great keynote presentations and so forth. And I thought, I have a proof that David's actually right. Because you may not know this, but a fellow pilot and a fellow professor was the man known as Neil Armstrong, arguably the most famous person in human history, first human to walk on the surface of the moon. Well, what did he do After he retired from NASA, just a few years after walking on the moon, he only went once. He made that first step, lasted 2 hours on the moon, went home. So how do you come down from that? How do you not go crazy as some people did and really off the deep end from that experience on the moon? He became a college professor at the University of Cincinnati. And I thought that was quite a good proof text, as we say in the Talmudic business, that that's actually true. But maybe flesh that out a little bit. The perils of fame are numerous. I talked to Neil again, as you noted. He's this amazing person with this huge gift and he's got 14.5 million Twitter followers. He told me during COVID, when he's wearing a mask, he is not anonymous. He is not able to walk down the streets of Manhattan. He is not able to take the subway. He will not open his voice if he's in a crowd of more than a few people because his voice is so iconic. Flesh out that idea of niche fame a little bit. Not that I have too much to worry about, but what are the kind of the downsides? You have 150,000 followers. You're not kind of the fame that will, unless you walk by my house, people aren't going to recognize you. But talk about that, the trade-offs with fame and internet fame in particular.
Yeah. So really just shook me was Tim Ferriss wrote an article, I think it was called 11 Reasons Not to Be Famous. And I was like, wow, I don't want to deal with any of these issues. And it was really scary. It was just a life-changing article for me. And the thing is that there's a lot of perks of being famous, though. And so it's like, okay, how do we think about this? And what is a categorization and a distinction that we can draw between the kind of fame that we do want and the fame that we don't want? And look, I'm not saying that this will lead to zero bad things, but I'm saying it's a very different kind of fame that the internet has actually enabled, and I call it niche fame. So what celebrity fame is a lot of people know you're covered in tabloids, and it's just more. So you try to reach a mass audience, and you're sort of known for your image. And then, look, the lines aren't super clean. So bear with me here. It's just like, it's a model, right? Some models are useful, but none are accurate. And what niche fame is you're known for your ideas, and rather than being well known, you're well respected. And the reason why I say that it's the fame of a college professor is that what a really good professor has is the ability to meet really anybody that they want to meet in terms of the people in their field. Other people are reaching out to them. Somebody will say, hey, I've been really influenced by your work, and so your ideas are actually going to work for you. And then they'll reach out to you. You have all this magical serendipity, but they can walk down the street and they can actually open their mouths. They can take the subway in New York City. They can go out to eat, and they're not like mobbed and attacked by people because the average person has no idea who they are. And I think that what the internet has done is it has allowed many more people to be niche famous, because now what the internet did was it democratized the means of creation and distribution of ideas. It's way easier to, this is almost like producing a radio show, but we don't need to go to KNBR studios in downtown San Francisco to record this. We can record it from the comfort of our homes, the comfort of our offices. And then we don't need to distribute this over very tightly regulated airwaves where you actually have to get permits to go and publish stuff on the radio. You can just sign up for a Libsyn account and you can publish a podcast. And because of that, the number of people who can be known for their ideas has expanded by an order of magnitude. And the internet has a beautiful way of nichifying things. And you can pick something that's quite narrow, like teaching writing or being really interested in physics or science. And then you can focus on that thing that you want to be known for, not just be totally unknown to the average person who you would see on the street, and yet have thousands and thousands of people who are interested in your ideas reaching out and creating intellectual serendipity in your life. And I think that that's a really nice way to live.
And that nichification, just to push back a little bit on you, you have an extremely diverse kind of spectrum of talents. I call you the Liam Neeson of the internet. You have a very broad but a very particular set of skills that the bad guys need not trifle with. So are you not taking your own advice? You're not very niche. A lot of what you're doing is broad. You're doing videos, you're doing exposés, and exposés. You're doing explorations of Peter Thiel on one hand and David Hilbert, the mathematician, on another hand. You're studying the Assayer by Galileo and philosophy. Yeah. You're taking pilot flying lessons. Are you needing to take some of the great David Perell's advice, or are you able to handle?
Interesting. So I think that there's a lot of ways to think about niche because, look, on one hand, those things look entirely different. But to me, they're actually all the same thing. I only do one thing. I learn obsessively, collect ideas, have conversations, and I'm driven by what I find to be interesting, inspired by that paper, Driven by Compression Progress. Then I distill those experiences through writing, through just and then I share those experiences, and I do that through teaching, I do that through podcasting, I do that through YouTube videos, I do that through writing essays, sharing newsletters. And really what it is it's a celebration of learning. It's going out, trying to reject a lot of conventions in terms of how we should think, and trying to find ideas that are in the peripheral vision of society that people are maybe missing, and trying to find those things and just following my intuition, kind of skip and dance as I learn and make sense of the world, and then share that with other people. And so the only projects that I ever take on are projects that require a tremendous amount of intellectual curiosity, where I have a team, but I have space to sort of wander and sort of move at my own pace and just meander as I go to explore. Ones where I can be on the move and just create and then share that with other people. And by doing that, build an audience. And so, yes, on one hand, I'm very sort of broad, but in terms of my skills, which is really just collecting ideas, synthesizing ideas, sharing ideas, and then building an audience through that celebration of learning, it's very specific, and I do nothing else besides that.
Very nice. Well, I could talk all day. As I said, we're going to run out of time because I have to teach a bunch of undergraduates about
What are you teaching?
I'm teaching introductory cosmology for advanced undergraduates, majors in physics. So it's a lot of fun. It's what I do in my day job, building telescopes that see invisible radiation left over from the Big Bang. And so I get to teach the brightest luminaries in the cosmos that will make the dent in the universe that we need to make progress. And David, we've come to the final 3 questions that I ask all my guests, from 9 Nobel Prize winners to 3 billionaires and to brilliant individuals such as yourself. And I would like to begin that process now, if you're willing to go with me into the impossible.
Let's do it.
Okay, the first question is an easy one. Can you provide a 16-dimensional unification of quantum mechanics with the electroweak force? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Give me a hard question.
All right, that'll be our next interview. It's so simple, you'll put it in the margin, as Fermat once said, right? Okay, first of all, this relates to our Judaic connection that I guess I first learned of you through Rabbi Wolpe, your wonderful interview with my friend Rabbi David Wolpe, who I love.
He did such a beautiful job on that interview. All credit to him. That
interview, yes, it was far superior to the 2 interviews I've done with him, and it actually brought me to tears in certain parts. So I refer people to David's podcast. It's a wonderful podcast. What's the name again? It's
the North Star podcast.
North Star podcast. I love the star. I should not have forgotten that. Polaris, right. Yeah. So I want to ask you, when you reach the biblical age of 120 years old, what ethical will, what zava'ah, as we say in Hebrew, what wisdom or values would you most want to communicate to those people that will become your ideological heirs?
Don't be so quick to dismiss ideas. You know, what I love about philosophy is, I spend a lot of time with philosophers, and what I love about them is that they can entertain ideas that they disagree with, that they think are absolutely psycho, and they can entertain ideas and play with those ideas and then only make judgment decisions on those ideas later. And I think our society would be so much better if people could wait to make value judgments on the merits of an idea and actually understand that idea and always ask, what if it's true? And if you do that, you will live a richer life for yourself. And I think the world will be a much better place.
Oh, that's beautiful, David. And concise, which I love. The next one is also related to the namesake of my center here, the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Sir Arthur was, of course, a great scientist, but also a great writer. And he, in 2001, A Space Odyssey, he has these monoliths that are kind of like time capsules meant to preserve some information from a long-deceased alien civilization. If you were to be given a monolith that would last for 1 billion years, is there anything you would put on it or in it or about it? Hopefully not like a CD-ROM or something that will be immediately evident if one were to read it. Could be short or long.
I think I would put access to YouTube. I think YouTube is just, and I mean, and I'm sort of assuming YouTube in terms of what it's going to become. I think video is the most democratic media, and the access that you have to anything that you could imagine on YouTube, I think will stand the test of time, and it won't die with the years.
You should get to know my friend Noah Kagan if you don't know him.
I ran into him at breakfast 2 weeks ago.
Well, say hi next time you see him, although he's biking across the country right now. Last question for you, David, has to do with going the opposite direction on the timeline, going backwards in time. And it relates to Sir Arthur C. Clarke's famous laws, one of which is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And that's the origin of my podcast name, Into the Impossible. Accordingly, what advice to a younger David Perell, say 10, 15 years ago, would you give to give him the courage to go into the impossible?
It's so easy. It's what I'm going to spend the next 10 years delivering this message. Share your ideas in public. Share your ideas in public. Share your ideas in public. It is, you have been given a gift of a phone in your pocket where you can create media and you can distribute it for free. You are now faced with a tremendous opportunity. And do you have the courage to stick your neck out, to share your ideas, and to then receive all the wonderful serendipity that comes with it? I can just tell you that that's what happens, and you won't believe me until you experience these things experientially and actually feel it firsthand. But sharing ideas online right now is one of the best things that you can do with your life. And the aperture of this strategy is so wide. No matter what it is that you're interested in, you can do it. And the returns on doing it for years and years are extremely high, intellectually, professionally, and socially.
I love the way you put it at one point. You said increase the surface area for serendipity by writing in public. And also, as I have to commend you because, it's safer to take the, middle road and not be too controversial. Even exposing your ideas too much. It could be, a famous Italian saying that, when you're right over the target, you get the most shots taken at you. But I'll end with an aphorism that I love, which is that if you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit by both sides of the traffic. So take a side and be brave and be courageous as David is. Find him at Perell.com, at David_Perell on Twitter, where he's got a legion. I'm just a little bit fearful, but also excited to see what you do with this army of legions, David. It's so impressive to meet you. I will not comment on your age, but I will say keep going, Hatzlacha, and blessing to you. And I wish you, because today is Friday, a Shabbat Shalom. And I hope we meet again, David.
Shabbat Shalom. I hope so. I'll let you know when I'm in San Diego. I would really, really love to meet and then go tee it up at Torrey Pines next door.
I would love it. One of my sons is like a mini David Perell, and he's going to be just like you someday, hopefully. He's the one who carries around a paper notebook so that he can have a second brain as well. Best to you, David. Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. You too.